Hi, everyone. My name is Edisham Khan, and I'm with Peekage, a digital sampling platform. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Fireside Chat. Today, we'll be discussing topics around brand marketing, and I'm so excited to have with me the extraordinary Shingly Lee. She'll be covering topics today, including building a brand, launching new products, and building product trials. She's had an extraordinary career working at Alpha Foods now, but has worked for big and small brands, including Kraft Heinz, Danone, as well as others. Shingly, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me on. Hi, everyone. Super pleased to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being with us. So Shingly, I know I went over some of the positions that you've held, but I'm sure our audience would love to know some of the details behind your background as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I started my career at Kraft Heinz, rotated between the marketing and sales functions after graduating from Queen's University here in Canada. And I've really stayed in CPG my whole career. Started at Kraft and then rotated to Danone in the nutrition and supplement space. And recently, I'm at Alpha Foods, as you mentioned. It's a based in the U.S., a startup in frozen, convenient plant-based foods, really aimed to help you have your favorite craveable foods without compromising your health. So I will absolutely say that the marketing discipline that I have today, I owe to my time building brands and building my foundation at multinationals. And now I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to take those learnings and help build from the ground up.
Yeah, I mean, that's extraordinary. I mean, just having that background and going into those situations, I mean, is amazing. I mean, so with that experience with multinational brands, how has that helped you when working with a newer, younger brand?
Yeah, great question. There's a couple key things that make a huge difference when you're starting out a brand or starting a newer company, to be specific. In CPG, you learn in the trenches, and it's very aggressive brand share wars, right? The stakes are typically higher in multinationals. So at Kraft and at a Danone, usually you're working with multi-million dollar brands. And so if you're not good or you're not disciplined, your brand loses share. And if you lose share for too much too long, the stock could crater in the company or you're affecting the overall business unit performance. And so it's not for the faint of heart, but what you do learn is a very disciplined approach to figure out how to make sure your brand is well positioned, how you have the right innovation at the right pace, supported in the right way, with the right adequate levels of awareness and trial at the right price with the right product. So I typically use to frame my mind the three P's and awareness and trial. So positioning, price, product, awareness, and trial. And you kind of want to get the balance of those five elements right. And I was very fortunate in my career to have worked on several brands that have had a lot of difficulty in some way or another. And I've kind of followed the same path in solving and tweaking the brand problems to ensure that equation falls right using consumer research, insights, intuition, judgment, and good marketing common sense.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And I love the three Ps. That's awesome. Did you come up with that yourself? Did you steal that or was that your own?
I mean, I think that's kind of the fundamentals that we learn, and yeah, over time you just kind of figure that out. You do learn the four Ps in business school typically, but I've come to learn it's more about positioning, product, price than it is about the four Ps that you classically learn.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what we're seeing on our end, and I think you really nailed it. That's what brands are really interested in these days, or in newer brands, especially in those really early stages. What strategies would you recommend to those folks in those really early stages that are trying to make a name for themselves?
Yeah, one of the first things I learned is that the first step is always positioning. Um, and positioning can be expensive, but it can also be very cheap and smart. You just want to optimize it enough times with research, right? The reality is in the food business, especially with emerging brands, and when you're just launching out in the natural and specialty channels, it's hard and it's expensive. And lots of entrepreneurs, understatement of the year, are learning on the go, fixing things on the fly and making sure that the ship is just sailing, right? Um, but when you neglect positioning in the forefront, in the back end, changing the packaging is a big deal. Revamping all of your formulas is a big deal, and it starts draining all the resources that you have when you're scaling. So if you can learn before you launch, which is what a big part of what you learn in CPG, where I've spent most of my career learning how to not make the mistakes before you launch. And at that point, when you're in the market, you're doing rapid evolutions, but you're not re-engineering the brand. And often as an emerging brand, you're kind of pivoting your positioning, pivoting your products. And when you're doing that in market after you launch, that gets really, really expensive. So learning the basics of brand building and positioning products, price value, how to grow the brand early, it delivers a lot of risk in the long run. So I think the first question I always ask is, how does a brand describe itself to motivate consumers and stake out a space in the market where it can win? So really, brands have four choices, right? Like, you're either better, you're different, you're cheaper, or you're not around for very long. And so this brand positioning piece, right, a winning brand positioning, marries what a consumer wants with what your brand does best, almost always better or different than your competition. So
Wow.
getting that
Yeah,
right.
no, you said a lot. You said a lot right there. That's excellent, because there's literally a war for new customers going on right now, especially in this COVID time, COVID area. I bring it up a lot on these podcasts. It's just, we're living in a new environment, and strategies have to change. And one thing I think you touched on a bit, but I know our folks at home are going to be really excited to hear what you have to say about defining a target audience and how you reach that target audience in an effective way. If you could share some of your insight on that, I know that would be great as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge believer in fewer, bigger, better, or different. I think the best half of brand leaders, brand manager, understand that focusing makes you bigger, not smaller. But oftentimes I've seen the other half wanting to spend their limited resources against unlimited choices, right? And so that math just doesn't check out, right? You have limited resources, so you have to limit your choice to match up to that. And that's just a basic business concept, right? And you want to spend against the best things will pay back both in the short term and the long term. So if you try to be everything to anyone, you end up being nothing to everyone. And if you try to be on every channel, on every shelf, you will have so little impact on any channel or any shelf that no one will see you. So I think that the key is really understanding your target, have a focused message on what we know will work with this target group. And this target group you can get through either focus groups or understanding some of your loyal followers on your social media channels, right? And from that, you build a focused distribution plan that your sales team can execute on, and a media plan that will pay back, or have the best estimate that'll pay back. And that's when you can get the finance people to give you money, because I mean, with a focused message, then they're taking money from a brand who wants to be everywhere and anywhere, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You really painted a great picture of the pace that folks have to go at, and doing everything at the right time. We have a lot of brands that approach us at Peekage that want to go widespread and wide reach and all that. And we tell them, in the earlier stages, to go targeted, to build advocates for your brand and build that small brand and grow that way is really important. And what they run into a lot of the time, which leads me to my next question, is once you've found that perfect customer, the perfect audience, how do you connect with those folks? How do you really engage with those folks? What are the best ways?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think once you understand your target audience, you want to stick to it, right? Again, like smart positioning, it always starts with that. Brands that try to be everyone to everything to everyone end up often being nothing to no one. And so a brand positioning statement is what we live by and what I always recommend that we have. And that starts with your target, the consumer target your brand will serve. It should focus on really two things: where to play and how to win. It should get down to understanding the emotional and functional benefits that your brand will stand for. And so really a very smart brand positioning statement should narrow the target to those consumers who are most capable of loving what your brand does. Doesn't mean that you're not going to halo effect to everyone else, but the tight target market decides who is capable. But it also helps you decide who is in your target and who is not in your target. And I think that's the key part. It's understanding who you're going for, but also who is the enemy. Who is not in your target and who you don't want to spend your limited resources against, right? And I think that's one of my best examples is if you're a elite shoe company, right, and you want to innovate for the elite performer, then you want to bring like the lightest soles, I don't know too much about elite running shoes, but lightest soles, things that will make you go faster for longer, having good support systems. But all of a sudden, if your brand manager is like, well, how about that next group of people who want to be elite? And so all of a sudden you're expanding your shoe and then you're losing your elite runners who really should be your core target. So build the shoe for the elite runner, and then the people who aspire to be elite runners will come. And that's how you ensure and make sure that you don't spread your brand's limited resources across the entire population, which is completely prohibitive.
Yeah, as we all know, marketing dollars are important, and it really matters, where you're spending them. And one thing you touched on that I feel like is really important that gets lost sometimes is the importance of realizing who's not your customer. So many people are trying to focus on who is my customer and don't really focus on the people that are probably never going to buy their product and just not interested. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because a lot of folks just focus on the one and tend to forget the other sometimes. So one thing that I know newer brands want to know and really want to get some insight on is product launches, especially with this year and things having to be done a little bit differently. What would you recommend to a newer, younger brand to optimize their product launch?
Yeah, I mean, especially with COVID, it's been hard because consumers are changing the way they shop. They revert back to things they know. And so as a new brand, it becomes even more challenging than ever before. One of the things in CPG, I mean, you learn the basics of line extensions and how to validate your line extensions or new innovations. And there is a optimal point where you don't have too many innovations, right? So what we're seeing with the big brands right now is that they have too many line extensions and they're left, especially with COVID and kicking in operational efficiencies, they're left discontinuing product. So all the new guys are coming in, right? And our turns are much faster than the 40 SKUs that the big brands don't have on shelf. So my background is the whole art and science of doing that and understanding, I think the simple way to think about it is that there's all these different tools. You can do concept research, then you can research, what is the new flavor, and then you optimize. And really what you're trying to do is to figure out if you have, for example, 4 SKUs and that makes a brand block, you got to understand, well, that would be my revenue. And then understanding, well, if I launch 6 SKUs or 8 SKUs, what would be the cannibalization of the 6th and the 8th so that I still net incremental? And I think that's really the trifecta or the holy grail, because with oftentimes with consumer packaged goods, when you scale to a certain point, you innovate or you die, right? And if you don't innovate, you die. But the reality is the innovations typically have a 80 to 90% fail rate. So that's a super funny dynamic of what you're trying to figure out. And sometimes and we can talk about this more in terms of brand launches, but you could innovate only to block shelf space.
Yeah, wow, that's really, really great insight. And it's so funny because there really is a fine line because of what you mentioned with the innovation, the successful rate of them. But then there's also the aspect of, this is definitely not my quote, but I've heard, the last words of a dying company are, "We've always done it this way." So you never want to be saying that. You always want to be growing and changing, but in the right way. So to touch on that, yeah, in your opinion, like, what are the most important components of product trial? What would you say like has to happen, has to be in your playbook?
Yeah. Um, that's a really good question. Three things, right? I think positioning, again, is more important than marketing spend. Oftentimes, I see successful innovation really taking um, what is tried and true with maybe one or two variables change. So I always think like a lot of entrepreneurs, founders, innovators are always like, we're going to chase the white space, white space, white space. And I'm like, I am a big believer that white space is overrated. If it's white space, it's probably there for a reason. So what you want to do is take something that consumers are familiar with and change just one thing, one variable, right? For example, Greek yogurt. Perfect example. That's yogurt, right? So something that consumers have been familiar with for years with protein. And that's the one new variable. Doesn't have to be something that no one's ever heard of, right? So I think that's the positioning piece. The second is if your product is sold off of a store shelf, your packaging is more important real estate than any of your advertising. And the reason is because 100% of your buyers will see your packaging, whereas a much smaller percentage of your buyers will see your ads. So for me, when I evaluate packaging, beauty and elegance is a luxury, but clarity and simplicity is the necessity. And I mean, as consumers, we're very, very discerning, right? Most of us will react when a consumer or a company's message is conflicting. So if you're telling me to pay, and this goes back to the 3 Ps, right? So if you're telling me that your product is worth twice the price of our competitors, then make me feel like it's worth it, right? If you want me to think that you are sustainable, it would make sense to have your packaging material reflect that. And because most brands don't have a salesperson on every single floor at every single store shelf, like what we do have is the packaging, and you got to make that work hard for you. And then the third piece, right? A very targeted marketing plan goes back to the tight target. You have to identify the people who either want your product or need your product most, and then figure out how to convince them to buy it. Oftentimes we go with like who's already buying us, but as a small brand, you actually risk subsidization of new products, right? So if a consumer is very loyal to your brand and they're using your one or two products already, well, if it's not like a granola bar, like if it's a bigger purchase, then you're very likely not going to buy two. You're probably going to switch over to the new innovation, try it, maybe like it, and then come back or lose altogether. So what you want to do is figure out what is that lookalike buyer or net new buyer who, for this innovation, is incremental to your brand. And then I mean, the last piece is making sure that you're encouraging engagement and trial, and that's really what's most important. Ultimately, get the product. I mean, if you're in the food business, you want to get the product in people's mouths, right? I mean, there's a number of mediums to grow your awareness, but ultimately, what we need to get to in food is sampling, sampling, sampling. Get the food in people's mouths. If you have the right product at the right price, loyalty will come after you get trial.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Until we create a smell-o-vision where I can just scratch my screen here and smell some cookies or some snacks perhaps, or get one through the screen. That's really the only way of doing it right now. And there's so many great things that you touched on. One thing that I really wanted to highlight is the competition is when you're, trying to distinguish yourself and really make a name for yourself. And what advice could you give for those brands? And you touched on it with the research part, and if that's a huge part, would love to hear more about that, about the competitive part about a product launch, about featuring your product? Why is it different? Why is it better? What innovation are you coming out with that people should try this?
Yeah, I think I always look at, the consumer need. Well, I mean, when it comes to innovation, it's really a golden triangle of win with the consumer, win with the retailer, win with the company, right? And so for the consumer, it's understanding what is their need. And for the competitor, it's understanding what is their Achilles heel. And so
Mm.
that's the piece of winning with the consumer and retailer of, hey, like how will taking my innovation drive incremental traffic to your shelf, incremental either a trade up strategy. So instead of buying the $2.99 product, you're buying our $3.99 product. And then win with the company, making sure that your company is ahead of the game and ahead of the category in both the what your consumer wants and making sure that your product is either better or different than your competition.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Shingly. This has been amazing. I know this is going to be so valuable for our folks viewing this, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge, your experience, and everything else. Wonderful. Well, I'm so glad you were able to do this. Please join us for other episodes. We'll have other amazing guests, of course, like Shingly, and continue to talk about brands and digital marketing and how we can survive in this ever-changing world. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.